Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. It is my pleasure to talk to David Henderson today. Until his recent retirement, David was a professor of economics at the Naval Postgraduate School in California. He is the author of The Joy of Freedom, editor of Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, and a fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He's also one of today's leading communicators in economic ideas. Welcome.
Thanks, Juliet.
Today, I want to make an exception to my informal rule that I've set for myself of trying to avoid talking about the pandemic. The reason is that David wrote this really interesting piece making the case for liberating people from the lockdown of the pandemic that we are under in the majority of states. The piece is called Liberation from Lockdown, and it was published at the American Institute for Economic Research 2 weeks ago. But before we start, I want to ask you one question that I ask all my guests. What is the most important thing that you think people my age or in my generation should know, but we don't?
Well, I'll confess you gave me time to think about it. And so I had to narrow it down because I came up with 3 or 4. So I'm going to give, you asked the main one, I'll give the main one. Maybe we'll even get to some of the others. But here it is. And in a sense, it has nothing to do with economics, but in a sense, it has everything to do with economics.
Interesting.
I think the main thing people in your generation need to know, and people in my generation need to know, and people in all the generations in between need to know, is that the world owes you exactly 0. I think that so many people get the idea that they deserve something just by being human. Now, I do think there are things we deserve by being human, and those are called rights, individual rights. So I have the right to live my life, and that means you don't have the right to murder me. I have the right to make income, and that means you don't have the right to take my income. So you owe me respecting my rights, just as I owe you respecting your rights. But what I don't owe you is making sure you get a good job, making sure you get a good education, making sure you're taken care of in some physical way. And similarly, you don't owe me that either. And by the way, Juliet, I happen to know you're 17 years old. So you've got this huge set of Social Security taxes you're likely to be paying for the next 50 years to support people like me and people younger than me. And I say you don't owe me that.
I think a lot of people don't think that way, and I think it would do us some good to have more people kind of think about that and kind of assess what is quote unquote owed to them for living, for being human.
Right.
I think that's pretty important. Good job.
Yeah. And I think also, I was trying to, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, okay, what specifically for your generation? And then I thought, well, why does it have to be? I think this is the most important thing people in your generation need to know. But I think it's the most important thing 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old, 80-year-olds need to know also.
Do you think that more people understand that as they get older? Or do you think that the amount of people who don't understand that concept is the same in each generation?
That's a good question. I think if you look at, say, my father's generation, my father was born in 1910. He had me at a relatively late age. And I think people in his generation had the idea that people didn't owe them anything. But I think one of the really corrupting aspects of the welfare state, including Social Security and Medicare and things like that, is people come to believe that they're owed. So I think there's something people in my generation talk about called the School of Hard Knocks. Have you heard of that?
No,
The
actually
School of
haven't.
Hard Knocks is the school that many people go to that's not a school. they get to know by hard knocks, they get to know by being knocked down what works and what doesn't. And so if you've been in that school a lot, you've probably learned a lot about what the world doesn't owe you. But if you've been kind of coddled, if you've had kind of everything taken care of for you, and then you go to college, let's say, and people say, well, you had a good reason for not doing well in that test. I'm going to give you a B plus, whereas you really earned a C plus, those kinds of things. Then you're not going to learn it as quickly. So the great thing actually about the job market, especially the job market in the private sector, is you kind of have to learn that. In the government sector, it's a little iffier, but in the private sector, you kind of have to learn that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, moving on to kind of the role of government in this pandemic. First, I wanted to ask you whether or not you think that preparing for a pandemic like this or responding to one is the role of the government. I think that economists often talk about public good, especially like pandemic environments, stuff like that. For my listeners and just my general understanding is that when economists use the term public good, they have something very specific in mind. It's
Yeah.
a bit technical, but it kind of boils down to a public good is a service or a good that when it's provided to one person, no one else can be prevented from using it. So it's available to everyone, even if they don't pay for it.
Yes.
So think of like the government trying to make the air in Los Angeles cleaner. Everyone has access to the air and there's no way to like make people pay for it.
Right.
So then no one can be stopped from enjoying it and there's no incentive to pay for it. And that's what the theory is. So is fighting against a pandemic a public good?
So I want to answer that. But first of all, Julia, I want to confess that I got goosebumps as you were talking, because you said that about as well as my ace students who were in their early 30s said it on tests. So I just want to compliment you on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I think parts of preparing for a pandemic are public good and parts aren't. Let me look at some that aren't. We don't know yet how effective ventilators have been for people who have COVID-19. There is some evidence both ways, but let's say they are effective. Let's say they're a net good. If I use a ventilator, you can't use the same ventilator. So, as you said, so there are two aspects of public goods. You focused on the more important one, which is what we call non-excludability. If I'm using it, you can use it too. Well, clearly, a ventilator isn't that way. If I'm using it, you can't use it. So it's also that fits the other part of it, which is non-rivalry in consumption, a fancy way of saying if I'm using it, you can't use it. And so a friend of mine who's very libertarian, a very extreme libertarian, said on Facebook, well, if you're saying, the government wasn't prepared, how many of you went out and bought ventilators? And I got to confess, I didn't. And so there is a part of it that really is a private good. So, but nevertheless, there are parts that are public good. Think of the coronavirus and how it spreads. And somehow, if someone figures out a way to prevent it from spreading or slow it from spreading, that affects a lot of people who don't necessarily have to pay for it. So there is a public good aspect. Now, having said that, here's the problem. You can say it'd be ideal for the government to provide it, but then we have to look at the real government. My mentor, the person who got me into economics, was a man, he died in January of 2019, a man named
Wow.
Harold Demsetz. And I had him as a professor at UCLA. And he talked about what's called the nirvana approach, which is what a lot of people who advocate government interventions have. They can picture this nirvana world, this ideal world in which government does the right thing. But what they don't seem to be able to tell you is how to set up the incentives so that government does do the right thing. So, think about why we have this public good problem. It's a problem of incentives. You don't automatically handle the incentive problem by putting it in the hands of the government. And so, we had in California, Arnold Schwarzenegger was our governor or in the middle of last decade, and he got all these ventilators and all these mobile medical units, and he was all ready for a pandemic that didn't happen. Jerry Brown came in as governor and said, hey, I've got this budget crunch. I'm going to sell these things off. And so how do you make sure government does the right thing? And we don't have a really good idea of how to do that. And so I would rather people say, you know what? I can't trust the government. Let me figure out how to get together with other people and deal with these things. And by the way, notice that some of the most successful things that are being done about this pandemic, and even Dr. Birx, do you watch those briefings at all with Dr. Birx, who wears the scarf?
Sometimes,
Yeah, a friend of
sometimes.
mine calls her Dr. Scarf. Anyway, if you look at, one day she said that she was amazed. That wasn't the word, but that was the tone. She was amazed at how well we Americans were doing at practicing social distancing, at wearing masks when we probably should be wearing them, wearing gloves, and so on. And those are by and large still voluntary activities. So there's a very strong, I don't want to call it a market because it's not a buying and selling thing, but it is part of the voluntary sector where we do these things.
Yeah, so it's kind of us as well as.
Yeah, right, right. So have you ever read or heard about, well, actually, your mom's from France. So have you ever heard about a guy who wrote a book called Democracy in America, a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville?
Yeah, actually, I learned about him in history in like freshman year.
Oh, okay. Well, you were way ahead of me. I learned about him when I was like in my 30s. And he came over here and he traveled around America and he was stunned by how Americans don't wait for government. They just get together and form associations and do things. And there's still a lot of that spirit alive. I taught military officers for 33 years, and they weren't all American officers. And I remember one time in my class about 8 years ago, impromptu, a student from Greece said he was so glad he'd brought his kids over to America and they were here for his 18 months so they could see this kind of spirit of voluntarism that Americans had that was way better than what they had in Greece.
I wonder why that is. Do you know?
Oh, I think I do. I think government crowds out the private sector. So when government has all these programs, people wait for the programs to kick in. When government doesn't have as many programs, people don't wait. And so we think of government here as being big. It's not as big as the government in Greece or France. And so they
Especially
still have
France.
less of a welfare state than they have.
Yeah, so talking about our government, let's talk about how they kind of botched this response.
Yeah.
Um, so you wrote that government officials, quote, spent many weeks sending contradictory messages, blocking testing, and generally being ill prepared also to manage us out of this mess, end quote. Leaving aside mandated closings and stuff, can you elaborate on some of these mistakes?
Sure. The World Health Organization, WHO, had this ready test for the virus. They offered it to America. The Centers for Disease Control, CDC, based in Atlanta, has say over that because we have a government set up to do this. And they said, no, 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 we want to invent our own. Right away, that took a little extra time. But then they
Mm-hmm.
botched it and it didn't work. So they lost a crucial month. And if you look at how this virus spreads, at least in the models, a month is a huge amount of time. So that
Especially
was
at the
one.
beginning.
And then there was this woman, Dr. Helen Chu in Washington State, who had some kind of grant to study some other kind of disease. I think it was the flu. And she was taking all these swabs and she starts hearing about what's happening in China in Wuhan province. And she thinks, hey, maybe I should start testing some of these swabs to see if we have it in Washington State. Well, she had to contact the Center for Disease Control to get permission. And then they said, well, it's up to the FDA. And the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, said no. And she pled with them and they said no. And then finally, in an act of courage, she tested anyway. And she found one young man who had not traveled abroad who had COVID-19, or maybe had the virus. I'm not sure. The virus leads to the COVID-19 disease. Anyway, she found that and she reported it. And did the FDA say, oh, our bad, I'm so glad you did this? No, they said cease and desist. So again, at various junctures, see, I don't believe the government is competent to really do these things, but I
Mm-hmm.
do think the government should be competent enough to not stop others from doing them. I have a little magnet on my refrigerator. The person who says it can't be done should not stop the person doing it. And that's essentially what the FDA was doing. So just a
Yeah.
lot of things like that. Also, the whole way you have to go through and get the FDA's permission for tests and do all the studies and all the double blind and all that slows things down. By the way, one good piece of news, the FDA has said we're going to allow various people to come up with tests for the antibody, and we aren't going to insist they even come through us. They can do it and they can price it and they can make money. My wife is 70, I'm 69. We have our appointment on May 4th to pay $175 each and find out if we have the antibody. And I don't know if you want to go there, but there's a strong reason I think we do because of how sick we were 2.5 months ago.
Wow. So that's good news.
Yeah.
If there are other people who are able, and also if you probably have the antibody, that's good news. But the fact that people are able to now create tests without the government standing in their way, I feel
Yes.
like
And
that's
the downside is, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
oh no, 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 you're
Okay.
fine.
The downside is, and the FDA has always made this point, there'll be a lot of crummy tests out there. So do we know that this is a good one? I talked to a surgeon in Phoenix who followed it yesterday, and this is what caused me to sign up for it. And he said he thinks it's good. Does he know that? No. But, let various things compete and see which ones come out. And I'd rather do that. And maybe I'm going to say I'm not satisfied, whatever they find. If they find the antibody, if they don't find the antibody, and someone will come along 2 weeks from now and I'll pay for that one too. Because think about it, the kind of the turmoil we've been in, because it says, they say the elderly are the ones most affected. Well, as I said, I'm 69, my wife's 70. I'd love to know. I'd love to know. And we'd sleep more peacefully if we did.
Yeah, I mean, and also there's the whole thing about in the market letting people be the judge of everything and kind of how through the reviewing process you'll figure out which ones are effective and which ones work best, right?
Right.
So,
Bingo, bingo. And it might take a while, but you probably will figure it out.
okay, so moving on to the effect of the lockdown. Let's talk about the closing of the economy. The
Yeah,
decisions made by state officials were kind of based on models by the CDC and National Institute of Health and other places. These models predicted millions and millions of deaths, and if we hadn't done anything, but even if we quarantined ourselves. So far, we've had less than 50,000 deaths, but there's also been a giant economic cost. So
right,
much that 22 million people are unemployed, businesses are struggling, and billions of dollars in government spending are going out to try and fix this problem. To just like that's what's happening.
right.
Can you talk about the shutdown and the costs?
Yes. And by the way, the model that was the most extreme was a British guy named Neil Ferguson, who also blew it on mad cow disease a number of years ago. And he predicted it was going to be this huge problem in Britain. It was a very small problem. I think it was under 100 deaths. He predicted thousands. He said the worst case was 2.2 million deaths. And he said that even with one version of his model, even with social distancing or various rules in place, it'd be 1 million deaths. So we're so far below that. Now, the question is, there are three possible reasons we're below that. One is they have a bad model. The second is social distancing worked. The third is the lockdown worked. I think it's mainly the first. In other words, I think it's mainly they had a bad model. And it's a new disease, so they don't really know. But I'm going to resign immediately as an epidemiologist and say that's what I think. But here are the other two aspects: the social distancing and the lockdown. A lot of us were doing the social distancing from early March. My wife and I were canceling dinner reservations. We go to Pilates twice a week. We decided not to. She was even more cautious than I was. But I have a downtown office I come to, and I'm hidden in it, so it wasn't hard for me to socially distance, even coming to my office. And then our governor, Governor Newsom, on March 17th, was the first governor to do this lockdown. Well, we had been practicing that for close to 2 weeks, as had many people. So what he didn't do was give social distancing a chance to work. So if we see, let's say the models were right, and again, I'm really doubtful that the extreme models were right, but if they were, to what extent is the reduction in deaths to an order of magnitude lower? To what extent is that due to the social distancing, and to what extent is it due to the lockdown? And so many people are assuming it was the lockdown. My gut feel, given just the people I observe in the world and the people I read about, is the social distancing was more important and much lower cost. Now, we would have lost a lot of restaurants and bars. I mean, I don't know when I'm going to go into a bar again, but it's going to be months. And so we would have lost a lot of those things, people just not going to them. But would we have lost the factory where people could relatively easily be 6 feet apart and or wear masks and gloves? Would we have lost, in other words, a huge slice of our economy? I got an email from Starbucks, where I used to go a lot, saying, we're going to separate tables. We're going to make sure everyone's apart. They sent that out about 10 days before the lockdown. They never got to really try it because the lockdown replaced it. So there are just a lot of ways private businesses were trying to make it work, have social distancing, but still stay in business. And Newsom and 44 other governors said, no, we're going to do it our way.
Didn't even give businesses a chance or
Right.
social distancing.
Right.
So let's talk about reopening the economy.
Right.
In your essay, you make the case that it's imperative that we reopen the economy. You wrote, quote, many people fear the consequences of letting tens of millions of people go back to work. I'm afraid, but if we can't continue as we are, some say that we need to discuss when to free up the economy. No, we needed to discuss it long ago. The time for discussion has passed. We are surrounded by wreckage. This should not last one more day, end quote. Can you talk to us about your vision for balancing the need to stop this virus with the need to not destroy the economy?
Yes, it would be to open up, and open up doesn't mean places open. It means they're allowed to open, and some of them won't. But open up, allow them to open, and let people practice all of these behaviors, all of these things they've been doing for approximately 6 to 7 weeks, and then see what happens. And my own prediction is that I think we're at around 40 some thousand deaths now. I made a bet with a friend of mine. So I was one of the more Cassandra types back in early March. I really feared this. And so when I was looking at data, I thought there'd be at least 300,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I said on Facebook 200,000 in case someone challenged me to a bet. Well, I ended up getting a bet with one of my former students and co-authors, Charlie Hoover, who was so optimistic he bet it would be below 100,000. And so I wrote up our bet on Econ Log, my blog, and laid out why I thought there's a good chance I'll lose. I still think there's a good chance I'll lose, and of course I'm delighted about that. So I think whether we open or whether we don't open, the number of deaths will be under 100,000. Now, why is that important? Because the CDC measures influenza deaths, flu deaths every year. The worst flu season we've had in the last few decades is just 2 years ago. and we had 61,000 deaths from flu. So 100,000 is less than 2 times the deaths from flu. Juliet, let me ask you, did you socially distance 2 years ago?
No, I
Yeah,
did
neither
not.
did I.
What?
Neither did
Sorry.
I. And so my point
Yeah.
is that we probably a lot of us still will, but as we see this thing slow down, we're going to gradually relax our standards over, say, weeks. And again, I think, say, by the end of August, we're going to have under 100,000 deaths.
Yeah, and I saw this survey. It was a very informal survey. It was on Instagram actually. It was one of my friends did it. And she asked, like, she said, if you were allowed to go outside tomorrow, would you? How long would it take you to go back outside? And the options were in less than a month, and the other option was in more than a month. Like it would take more than a month for you to go outside again. And a lot of people, it was like 67%. So like two-thirds said it would take more than a month for them to go back out and resume like even relatively normal activity. And I just found that really interesting. I think people are kind of really scared, but also really aware of like their own personal impact and their own actions.
Yeah.
But
And now, given that this was Instagram, this was relatively young people, right?
yeah,
Which is
yeah, it
amazing,
was.
because they're the least at risk. And so I think it's more people my age who are going to be a little nervous about going out. Although I'll tell you, because of the various things I've been reading by epidemiologists, I was on a panel discussion with one yesterday, Knut Witkowski, and he is so optimistic. And I thought, well, maybe, but uh, still, he moved me. He moved my prior view a little to be a little less nervous. So I went to Safeway this morning to get cream for my coffee, and I brought my mask, and I go in there, and there aren't that many people, and I'm just passing people quickly in aisles and not breathing on them. They're not breathing on me. I never put on my mask, which was a first in a couple of weeks. So I am getting a little more relaxed about it.
Well, so that's good.
Yeah.
Um so can you talk to us about the impact of the lockdown on lower income people? I'm thinking about people who can't be home, who can't work from home and they've lost their jobs. Like they're getting very generous unemployment insurance benefits for a while,
Yes.
and but it won't last forever.
Right.
And that takes away the benefits of actually working and being productive. And so, can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So this incredibly stupid plan that was pushed and that Trump went along with, Republicans went along with, was to have the federal government give an extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits. So there are now people in this country who are making $1,000 a week in unemployment benefits, and in many cases that's 20 to 40% above what they were making when they were employed. So they're going to stay unemployed until these run out at the end of July. And so um, they're not going to be hurt. I mean, they're going to be hurt as taxpayers way down the line, but they're not going to be hurt right now. Uh, but there are a lot of people who fall between the cracks. So, for example, I live in California, where we have something that's sometimes called the informal economy, namely, people working off the books, people working on their own as gardeners or whatever, never declaring income to the IRS. And so they won't have a basis for claiming these unemployment benefits. And so if they get shut down, that's a big problem for them.
Because
We
they
have a
don't get
local
yeah.
health officer named Edward Marino, who's been the one pushing for tighter and tighter restrictions on what people can do. And we have 5 county commissioners who just go along with it. It's absurd what they go along with. So he has just said, you can't have gardening. So we have a gardener and we want him to make a living. We want our garden to look nice, but even more important right now, we'd like him to make a living. So, and we live on a very, very public street. The cops go by all the time. And I saw one of them going up and shutting down a gardener a few days earlier. So I called him and said, We'll move my wife's car into the driveway further down. You park in the driveway so your truck isn't as visible on the road. And it worked out. But, well, I don't know if we were breaking the law. I think he was breaking the law. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just crazy. Like, he's outside. Everything we know, I mean, Trump botched it incredibly yesterday when this data show if you're outside and you're getting sunlight, that's great. And then Trump talks about, drinking turpentine or whatever. But anyway, so everything we know says it's good to be outside on your own, not near anyone. And this guy's trying to shut that down. Now, I just think I don't understand it, but I'm starting to think that maybe this guy, Edward Marino, is just a cruel man, just a mean man who doesn't really care about people. And I guess I got a little off track there. But anyway, so there's just all these things they're shutting down that even by their own models don't make sense to shut down.
So let's talk and conclude about hopes and fears. Can you talk about your fears, but also your hopes of what the world will look like on the other side of this when we're out of lockdown and this whole situation is kind of over?
So I'll talk about. Can I talk about my fears first and then my hopes because then it ends positively?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So my fears are that government kind of got the bit in its teeth and says, you know what, we kind of like this. When else can we lock down? Because it gave a lot of government officials a lot of power. That's my fear. My fear also is that people will think that, hey, the reason we're doing so well is because of the lockdown, not because of the virus itself, just kind of working its way out and getting herd immunity, and not because of social distancing. So the wrong lessons we learned. My hope is that people will see, pardon me,
No, you're
people will
fine.
see. Here's how my wife put it, who is not a libertarian, does not share all my libertarian views. But my wife put it this way a couple of weeks ago when that third package arrived from Amazon the same day. She said, one of the things that's come out really, really well in this is capitalism. I mean, they've been amazing at delivering things, whether it be, paper towels or masks or various kinds of special foods that we can no longer get at the supermarket. And I just hope people see that. So in other words, what we could get is actually people understanding that a little better. Related to that, various governments, including Cuomo in New York and Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, deregulated a little to make things easier. So Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, the governor, said, if you have a license to practice as a healthcare provider in any other state and you want to come here to help out, you're immediately licensed temporarily. Well, you know what? That kind of made sense to do anyway. And so Arizona, about a year ago, did that. That if you have no criminal record and you've got a license in any occupation in any state and you come to Arizona, you're automatically licensed. I'd like there to be no licensing, but short of that, we would get a whole lot more mobility, people able to move from one state to another if we adopted permanently that kind of thing. So I have a little hope for that. Another one is there's a health economist who's a friend of mine named John Goodman. He's in his early 70s. He's been practicing health economics for over 40 years. For over 20 years, he's been pushing something called telemedicine. And this was including in the old days when we had those things called phones. So have doctors be able to deal with their patients over the phone and still be able to charge for it. Well, Medicare suddenly said, you know what, you can do that. So I'm hoping that doesn't go away. I'm hoping we can now still have telemedicine and have doctors be able to charge for their services. That would make things a lot better.
Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure to talk to you. It was very interesting.
Thanks, Juliet.